Father, you're calling all the prodigals back home. You are restoring every heart to be made whole. The lost are being found and the sick are being healed. Beauty for ashes, let your glory be revealed. Have your way, Lord, have your way in us. Your kingdom come on the earth as in heaven. Your will be done.
Thank you to our in-person as well as our virtual audiences tonight. Those of you familiar with American Public Square may recall that it is our mission to bring people together to address polarizing and often contentious issues with civility, facts, and multiple perspectives.
As you'll hear tonight, there is significant disagreement about the most important causes for this rise in anti-Semitism, as there is about where the greatest threats lie in terms of anti-Semitism today.
Everyone on this panel represents a distinct aspect of what it's going to take to have the public safety that we want to have for Kansas City.
So to start us all off, I thought it would be good to ask your guys' perspectives as Gen Zers. How do you think things are going?
The George Floyd incident didn't happen here, but it touched a nerve across the country, and it started a conversation that needed to not just start, but to continue. The problem is the voices have gotten so loud on both sides of the discussion, we can't talk.
So from my point of view, the problem here is the lack of social cohesion and the breakdown of something that unites us as Americans. And to me, the way you fight that is by finding people you disagree with and talking to them like they do at American Public Square.
We have this agenda right now to reduce carbon dioxide emissions when we're not facing a climate crisis.
So when I hear how this amendment is neutral, it's very concerning for my community because there is no neutral decision for a BIPOC community.
Violent crime has increased and sensible gun laws will save lives.
The reason that the state legislature wouldn't change policing is because they know they have a red meat issue.
Now that we've talked about so many of these issues, what do we do about them? So what, now what?
So what, Gen Z cares about politics. So what, Gen Z maybe disagrees with you on a lot of stuff.
So what? We have a very important decision on or before August 2nd.
Now what? Let's get back into this country, into a place where teachers are respected, not vilified by legislation.
Now what? We need to work together to build a better society where 2/3 of all gun deaths in America aren't suicide.
We don't have to settle for the current partisan invective. Rather, we need to demonstrate a better way, especially to those who are young, before what they see around them becomes, in their minds, an acceptable way for our society to operate.
The message people living in democracy must understand, more than any other message, is that there are Americans who aren't just like you. They don't live like you, they don't have families like yours, and they don't think like you. They may not live in your neighborhood, but this is their country too. Thank you all for coming out, and good night. May we see you all again.
Oh my goodness. Well, good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be here tonight to see so many familiar faces and so many new faces. For those of you I've not yet had the pleasure to meet, my name is Claire Bishop, and as Executive Director at American Public Square at Jewel, it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's conversation. For those of you who are not familiar with American Public Square, that little video I hope gave you a brief idea of what we're all about. We exist to provide programming in the community to help residents through challenging conversations. And we do so with the purpose of improving the tone and quality of public discourse in our community. In addition to that, we offer a lot of programs like what you'll see tonight, which there's probably not going to be a lot of disagreement about this topic, but it's very important to us to work to connect people with tools and resources to build and strengthen civil society, and especially young people, which is the focus of our conversation this evening around Lindsey's book, which we'll get to in just a moment. But this work that American Public Square, I almost tear up every time I see that video because it is just so hard right now, and it's so important. And when I see folks like our partners at Church of the Resurrection, whose work is so deeply aligned with this work that we do at American Public Square in our community, I'm just beyond gratified to have folks, partners, who are as humble, as genuine, and as gracious as the folks and the team at the Church of the Resurrection have been in pursuing this shared humanity, this shared connection in our society, which is more important today than ever. And we know in an election year, it's important because we want a healthy and functioning democracy. We're going to talk about that a lot tonight. But we also know that it's a very personal thing. It supports our physical, emotional, and mental well-being when we can connect with others, when we can overcome loneliness, isolation, and extremism. So there are lots of reasons to join together in this work. And I'm grateful to each of you in the room this evening, to everyone who's signed on for this event virtually, who's attending virtually in the comfort of their living room tonight or wherever you may be, and our partners and the wonderful team at Church of the Resurrection who have been just incredible to work with. So thank you all. A very brief note on our author and special guest this evening, who will be shortly joined in conversation with Reverend Adam Hamilton, who I'm sure is a stranger to no one here. I had the profound pleasure to attend. This is now the second of 2 book talks with Lindsey that we've hosted this week. So last Thursday, we were up in the Northland at Pine Ridge Presbyterian hosting another of these book talks, which was my first opportunity to hear directly from Lindsey. And I just have to say, I am blown away by her passion for this subject matter, which I think is encapsulated in the book that she's going to be speaking to tonight, but also her pragmatism that really helps each of us understand how, as regular people, as regular parents, as people who know young people, you don't even have to have kids to be engaged in this work. She offers ideas and solutions that can truly help empower us to make better communities, a better country, and a better life for everyone. So really excited, thrilled to have you all here. I'm gonna hand this mic over in just one very quick second. But before that, I wanna make a couple of quick notes just about housekeeping and format for this evening. Our program will begin with Lindsey making a couple of summary remarks about her book and sharing some data and research that she's been engaged in, which I think will set a nice context for the conversation. She'll then be joined in a moderated Q&A with Reverend Adam Hamilton, and I'm sure that will be lively. But we also want, and I'm sure he's got lots of questions for her, so they will have no shortage of things to speak about, but we also want you all to be involved. So you've got question cards at your table. And if you would please, we'll be accepting questions from the audience, but we do it a little bit differently at APS. We ask that you write your question down on the card, and we'll have volunteers kind of walking around making eye contact with you periodically. If you just hold it up, they'll come around and pick it up, and then one of us will curate and ask those questions to the author and to Reverend Hamilton. So that's the general game plan. We're really excited for this program. I just wanted to give one final shout out to someone. I don't see him, but I know he's here, a special guest this evening without whom none of this would be possible, and that's Ken Thomas from the Kansas First Amendment Foundation, who originally introduced us to Lindsey. So Ken, wherever you are, there you are. Thank you so much. Great guy there. They're also doing wonderful work. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it on over to Reverend Hamilton and Lindsey for her comment.
Okay. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm so happy that you decided to come out on a Monday to talk about a subject that a lot of people never want to talk about at all. I promise it's not going to be that bad, but before I get started, I want to thank everyone at American Public Square for putting this together. Trisha and Claire and Robin have been wonderful partners for me, and I'm so honored to be here with Dr. Reverend Adam Hamilton. It is a true treat for me to come back to Kansas City, where I'm from, and share this with you. I also want to give a shout out to Ken Thomas, my former social studies teacher, and without whom none of this trajectory would have been possible. And I'd also like to recognize a public servant in our midst. Matt Kleinman is here, someone who I went to school with, who recently ran for Congress and knows what it is to do this work with all his heart. Thank you for being here, Matt. Now, you're going to have to bear with me a little bit on these slides. My understanding is that the animations might be a little off, but I promise that I'll walk you through what's happening. First, I like to start with a little bit about who I am. What you'll see here is there's a lot of different pieces of me, and they all speak to how I interact with politics. That picture with me on this sign, that's a little sign that I've put up in New York over the last year that says, "Will you chat with me about politics for 3 minutes?" And then I have a little sand timer, and I flip it over, and I hear whatever it is the person wants to talk to me about. It's a way for me to know individuals one-on-one, what they care about, what they're thinking about, what they're confused about, what they're frustrated about. And I've also taken to wearing these shirts that say, "Let's talk politics," in really big fonts, and just going on walks throughout New York City or in airplanes and seeing who's going to talk to me about what. That symbol at the top that says Stevens is the university that I work at. It's called Stevens Institute of Technology. It is a premier tech school on the East Coast in Hoboken, New Jersey, where most of my students go on to computer science degrees, mechanical engineering degrees, electrical engineering, but I do get a few who are interested in politics, and they all end up having to take the course because it's required. So I tell them, politics is going to happen to you whether you like it or not, so you might as well learn a little bit more about the process, and then we have a really good time together. In the middle, you'll see a little panel that says DC Inbox. That was my first big political project. DC Inbox is a publicly available free resource to researchers, journalists, and everyday people to go see what their members of Congress say in their official capacity in e-newsletters to constituents. So if you want to see, did my member talk about this vote? Has my member mentioned this issue? What about other members? That's something you can do at dcinbox.com, and that is my way that I got into federal politics because I've really got to see how members of Congress want to communicate. Then you'll see that's my first book, which is Congress and U.S. Veterans, from the GI Bill to the VA Crisis, which I'm really glad I got to write because it set me up to do this book. It let me look at policy from so many different perspectives. And then at the bottom, you'll see Community Board 8, which is how I know local politics. In Manhattan, I'm an appointed member of Community Board 8, which is our way of dealing with things like zoning, with liquor licenses, with new marijuana licenses in our communities, with schools, libraries, and educational facilities. And so that's where I sort of walk this walk and go figure out how politics happen in a way that doesn't feel that partisan like it does at the federal level. What I'm going to show you here isn't necessarily important for you to remember which states are colored which way, but this sets the backdrop for this story. In the United States, we do not have a one-size curricula about how our students understand government, politics, and civics. Instead, because of our federal system, every state gets to decide how much they're going to teach, when they're going to introduce certain concepts, what they're going to talk about, if they're going to have a test, and everything else on that. Furthermore, states usually devolve these powers down to school boards, who then devolve it to schools, who it really matters on what teachers in the classroom. So you can see, in the United States, we have a lot of different modes of delivery, but I'll tell you the two pretty constant things. Usually, in 7th or 8th grade, your students are going to get a class that's called like U.S. history or world history or some version of social studies. They'll learn about founders, they might learn about colonizing, they might learn about all sorts of things in the early days of the United States, and then they don't touch it again until their senior year of high school. And then in their senior year of high school, usually in the 2nd semester, they'll get a class called government, where we throw everything at them and we say, learn all these concepts, make sure you know all these offices, here's how you vote. And I don't know what you were like in your 2nd semester of your senior year of high school, but I know what I was like, and it wasn't certainly like, let me learn a lot of new hard things. It's not that, and it's really hard to expect our students to learn everything they need to know to hit the ground running and be able to participate if we wait that long. I think the way that we do this throughout the United States is too little, too late, and it's really hard to get all this work done in schools, which is why I wrote this book, to bring it into our homes, to allow us to sort of support schools and say that we need to focus and prioritize on this more. In this next slide, you're going to see the nation's report card scores on civics. The very bottom red line is the very basics that we would expect of 8th graders for them to understand the system that they're in. That blue line above it is where we've been since 1998, which is just above basic. The yellow line above that is what we would consider proficient, and then we consider superior skills at the green. We're not even close. When we looked at this, the way that we wrote our book was we looked at school curricula around the United States. I had 6 research assistants who then helped me look at all sorts of scores. This is the nation's report card. The next slide I'm going to show you is on AP US government, and then we also interviewed teachers in nearly every state to hear what they were doing in the classroom. What I'm going to show you in the next slide is one that gets a little bit messed up in the animation, but I'll point out what you need to see, which is, in this black and white graph in the background, you can see the black bar. That is the score on average for AP US government in the United States. It's at the very bottom. You have to get a 3 in order for you to have college credit, and on average, throughout the United States, our students do not get 3s. In fact, when we look at it in 2003, it is the second lowest out of all 38 AP test scores administered. AP US government is 37. Now, the people who take AP US government kind of think of themselves as good at this. They think it's like only 2% of our students are the ones who sign up for this. So this is the best of the best. And still, we can't show that they're sufficiently educated on these topics to be able to interact with our system in a way that they would get college credit. We also know that this spills over into real-life politics. What you're seeing here is the rate of turnout in our last federal elections in 2022 with 18-year-olds to 85-year-olds. And you can tell that 18-year-olds are playing a game of catch-up really until they get to their mid-40s. And part of this is that they just don't understand the process, and it's not their fault. It's not like they turn 18 and someone says, here's everything, you've got it. We have to work with them. We have to show them how it works. There's a few different routes to our civic deficit, and I'm going to focus on 4 here. One is we have a very intricate design. US government is not simple. It's not straightforward. There's many layers, there's many players, there's different roles, there's different rules. And so it's kind of hard to understand. It's not something we can get done in a year in 7th grade and then a semester in 12th grade. It's something that we need to pay more attention to. And every other subject we build, we start in kindergarten and we give a little bit more each year so by the time our kids graduate, they feel mastery in a subject. Additionally, we do have a tradition of not talking. And this wasn't true everywhere, but when we were doing our interviews, we found that mostly in the center of the country and in the South, there were taboos against talking about politics, even in settings like your family. It kind of sat in this bucket of things that were off limits like religion or sex or drugs or money. And if we're unwilling to talk about something, we have a really hard time learning about something. Additionally, when we do talk about it, oftentimes it's through a hateful lens. People say, oh, politicians are all in it for themselves, or this is a rigged game, or what egomaniacs, such dirty business. Our kids hear those messages. And what this image is meant to show you is that our kids are hearing negative political messages whether or not we say them. There's been surveys done of children's literature and children's media and children's entertainment. And oftentimes they'll have a character like a mayor. And at best, that person is a bumbling doofus. And at worst, they're out to do harm to the city that they're meant to protect. So our kids get this negative anti-politics, anti-government message. We don't need to add to that. Also, school's out. And what I mean by this is not that school isn't a place where this work can happen, is not that social studies teachers aren't some of the best hardworking teachers we have, but that there are some really big constraints that make it very hard to do this work in schools. One of the big things that's happened now is state legislatures throughout the United States have decided to say, what's off limits for you to talk about in the classroom? What frames can you use on this? How can you evaluate these subjects? You can have quibbles as to whether or not we should talk about some things in schools, but the fact that we have state legislators dictating this means that there is a chilling effect on teachers' abilities to talk through these subjects in a roundabout way. We also have a really big obsession with test prep. If we think about what our children are gauged on, it's how did they do on the SAT or the ACT. And the same thing is true for our schools. When we think about who gets blue ribbon designations or who gets any accolades, it's how well are your kids doing? What test scores are they getting? What colleges are they going to? And neither the ACT nor the SAT have any social studies, civics, governments components at all. So when you think about a curriculum that's crowded, what's going to get squeezed out? It's the stuff that no one's getting assessed on. It's the government, it's the civics. When we think about our prioritization in terms of dollars too, for every $50 we spend in the United States on STEM subjects, we spend 5 cents on civics. Let that sink in. That is such a wild disparity. I work at a STEM school. I understand what STEM can do. I think it has so many possibilities. We've seen our lives grow in wonderful ways because of science, technology, engineering, and math. But if the people doing that work don't understand the systems that underlie it, or can't think through the effects that that might have on our politics, we're hurting ourselves. And that's how I kind of square with my students. They say, I don't care about politics. I don't want to know about that. I'm in a meritocracy. The only computer scientists that get ahead are the good ones. And I say, well, that's not true. But also, if you're going to make these things, You owe it to us to understand our politics. Facebook changes our politics. Amazon changes our politics. You owe it to us to understand the systems that underlie these if you're going to make these new tools for all of us. There's a series of court cases that I go through in the book that have changed the way that teachers approach this topic. And then finally, I do have a little bit of blame to lay on parents. And this is one that's hard to hear, but it's a message that I find myself having to deliver, which is, when we interviewed teachers, nearly all of them said that especially post the pandemic, the amount of oversight and hate that they get from parents in their classroom is untenable. Even teachers who would say something like, I'm teaching the 3 branches. I tell them, Congress is the first branch. It's Article 1 of the Constitution. Most of the founders who wrote this were going to be in the Congress, not the president. Someone can go home, tell their parent, oh, my teacher doesn't like the president. She likes the Congress. That person inflames a Facebook group, sends an email to a principal, or harasses the teacher themselves for brainwashing them or making sure that they're seeing politics in their own ideological light. That was not what we found most of the teachers that we interviewed wanted to do, but it's a fear that they had. They're afraid of parents. Parental blowback is real. But I argue that parents can and should be our agents of change. We shape the way our kids dream. They look up to us for what we do and what we don't do. If they never see us caring about politics, if they never see us having a back and forth, or they never go to vote with us, they're going to get the message that that doesn't matter. That's for other people to do. That's not something that they're going to waste their time with. And children, they do politics. If you've ever watched kids try to play on the playground, they're figuring out the rules. They're saying who gets to do what. They have hierarchies. They're competing over resources. They do politics. They are curious, and something that we talk about in the book is a nationally represented survey where 77% of our 18 to 24-year-olds say, I want to do more about politics, I want to learn more about politics, but there are hurdles for them getting involved. I also think that it's important that we realize that no one likes playing a game they don't know the rules to. I feel like some of you might feel that way too about politics, where you have something where you think, oh, it's gonna change or this is gonna happen, but then someone says, no, that's actually not how it works. That never feels fun. So the more you know, the better this game can be for all of us. Things can also only get better with attention. I'm not worried about us talking about politics too much. I'm worried about us not having positive frameworks or supportive, productive frameworks. But I think the more people that think on this, the more people that say, you know what, it's worth me caring about it. I will learn a little bit more. Our politics can only get better. I also know, as a parent myself, that everyone wants their kids to be as powerful as possible. I don't want my daughter to feel lost in the world at the whims of other politicians or decision makers. I want her to have agency. I want her to feel effective. And I know that we all want our kids to be healthy. And when I see things that are plaguing our young people today, it's things like anxiety, uncertainty about the future. It's things like depression and hopelessness or loneliness and isolation. Getting a well-rooted sense of politics, especially in your local politics, is a really good way to combat these things. In local politics, you're pivotal. Local politics turns on the repeated interactions of people doing something with a purpose. It doesn't necessarily have to be a red or a blue cause. It can be, we're cleaning this playground. It can be, our sidewalks need to be free of litter. It can be, we're taking graffiti down. Things that make our quality of life better and aren't really partisan are good things to get our kids involved in. And finally, we all want our kids to be successful. And something that we talk about in the book is how getting your kids involved in politics when they're younger, before they go to college, is a good marker for college. Colleges want people who are pro-social. They want problem solvers. They want people who care about communities. They want to invest in people who are then going to go change the world and reflect well on them. People who care about politics tend to be those people. And we benefit as well. By willing to take on this work with your kids, you're going to learn something about them. You're going to bond with them in a different way. They're going to learn something about you. And the way that you view politics will probably change. I'll tell you it has with me in conversations with my daughter. Because our kids come to this world with a less prejudicial view than we have. They haven't lived through the politics. They're just trying to make sense of the world and figure it out. So it's nice to kind of step back and see how they see it. I'll say something on partisanship, which is, partisanship is inevitable. It is true in the United States, and it's actually true in any functioning democracy anywhere. There are going to be parties that sort of organize our interests. But raising a partisan is very different than raising a citizen. And I like to think about it as if you were raising an athlete. If you had a child who you wanted to be good at football, you would teach them the rules of football. You would run drills with them. You would have conditioning exercises. You would practice. If you wanted to teach them how to be a good fan, you might teach them everything you know about Patrick Mahomes. You might do all the Chiefs legacy that you can. You might say, we hate the Bills or whoever you hate. But in politics, none of us are truly spectators. We are all athletes. This system works because of us or without us, but we are the ones in the game. And so we want to raise our kids to be political athletes, not political spectators. This is not about making them little Democrats or making them little Republicans. It's giving them the tools to figure those things out for themselves and trusting that they will. Because frankly, our parties change, our personalities change, the ideological constellations of US politics change. But what would be better is if our kids understood what underlays it so they can be rooted in the system and say, here's what works for me. And this is a hard one for parents, but it's not even clear that you could convince your kids to see the world in the same way, even if you wanted to. Emerging research on how you can transmit partisanship to your child shows that it's about a coin toss. Half of the time, if you're a Republican, you can raise a Republican. Half of the time, you're going to raise a Democrat or someone who's opting for another party. Same thing for Democrats trying to raise Democrats. We're just not that good at doing this part anyway, so it shouldn't be the goal. The goal should be to raise kids who understand their system, understand the levers of power, know how to pull the things that they need to pull, and have a better politics because of it. So doing this work is not that hard. The first thing I always ask people is just to be willing. Something that I hear repeatedly is, oh, I don't know enough, or I just don't want to teach them the wrong thing or lead them astray. That's not the risk here. The risk is that you're not modeling behaviors of seeking more information when you should be. So just be willing to take it on. Learn a little bit more together. Do some of it alongside them. That's the best first step I can ever give to anyone on this. I also think that it's important that when you show them that you're caring, you're not just saying, oh, I support this team. You're showing them the process. How do you make these decisions? How do you figure out where to give your time and energy? And then I also think it's really important that we introduce our kids to local politicians. Because what I hear when I get students that are college age is they have this like amorphous idea of government as like these people away in DC making these decisions. When really, a lot of our quality of life decisions are happening at the state and local level. And most of the people doing that work are good volunteers who are trying their best to make decisions for their community when no one else is stepping up. So I think that it's important that we have opportunities to show our kids who does this work. And I'll tell you from my own experience, these people want to meet you too. Back in July, I was on a cruise with my whole family, and I have a niece, and she said, Aunt Lindsey, who's my mayor? And I was like, well, gosh, I don't know. There's a lot of mayors in the United States. Let's go find out. So we went to our cabin, we popped up my computer, typed in Mayor of Olathe, found out who it was. And she sat right next to me, and we sent him an email that said, hi, I'm going to be in town in September. My niece would like to know you. She's a constituent. Can we set up a meeting? And in a week's time, Mayor Bacon of Olathe said, sure can. And we met him on Friday out at a concert at Olathe Live, and my niece was tickled. And she's been talking about it in school and with our family, and I'm pumped that she got to see him. She also got so shy, and she was like, I'm not used to meeting important people. And I was like, oh, well, this is just the start. So I don't know who we're going to do next, but I was really happy that we got to meet him. I also ask that parents check their negativity. Our kids hear negative things about politics, even if we're not willing to do it. This is not to say there's nothing that's frustrating. This is to say, if you have something good in politics, I would ask you to try to point that out too. If you have nice roads, government had a hand in it. If you have clean drinking water, government had a hand in it. If your parks support your kids, you have senior centers where they can hang out, you have good playgrounds, government had a hand in it. Pointing those things out to your kids can show them that this is not all bad. There's good that can come from us acting collectively and getting outcomes that we want. In the book, I break it down into 3 places. I say, 5 to 9, you're not sitting those kids down and quizzing them on the Constitution. You're letting them see it. You're letting them see the conversations. You're building the vocabulary. You're introducing them to people. You're just making sure that they can humanize this system and understand that it's not big, amorphous outside of them. They're a part of that. Age 10 to 14, you can start building on some things. You have concepts. What is republicanism? What is democracy? What are the branches? How can we have checks and balances? You can also ask those kids to go be your little family researchers. If you have a local election, be like, why don't you go find out all you can about these candidates and tell me what you think? And let them kind of get the practice of gathering information and doing that sort of decision-making on their own and then coming to you with it. And then at age 15 to 18, I have 5 things that I go over that I say your kids absolutely need to know before I see them in college. Because if they don't get it there, they're going to miss that first election, and it takes a while to get their feet back under them so that they know how to exercise their power. I'm so happy to hear your questions. I'm so happy to have our conversations, and I'm grateful that you're here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cormack, and I want to thank Claire and American Public Square for sponsoring this event and allowing us to host it tonight. Thank you so very much. So I love your book, and I want to encourage every one of you, if you don't have it already, I want to encourage you to buy it. If you're a grandparent, and you have grandchildren, well, I guess you're not a grandparent if you don't have grandchildren. I want to encourage you to pick it up because it will help you when it comes to your grandkids and conversations that you'll have with them. But those of you who are parents, I'd love to invite you to do the same with yours, with your kids. And it's interesting, here at Resurrection, we're in this campaign right now. We do it every election season. This one's the Do Unto Others campaign. And we're trying to bring about a more civil society, a place that's depolarized and bringing people together. And I hadn't really thought about the important role of educating children about civics and how democracy works in shaping that. So we teach our kids these concepts in this campaign, but it really struck me what you're doing is so important. And if we want to have a better society in the future, a better and more healthy democracy, it has to start with parents teaching their children. I just thought that was really awesome. So you said something in here. You said, we shape the way our children dream. And it reminded me of Graham Nash's, teach your children well, their father's hell did slowly go by. Feed them on your dreams. The one they pick's the one you'll know by. And I think that's what you're trying to help us do. So say a little bit more about how do you share, I don't know if that all of us have dreams even about democracy. So how would we go about sharing really great dreams with our children about democracy? And I'm gonna ask you, and I know you have one daughter, Bunny is her nickname, if I remember correctly. Do you have any other children?
Nope, that's the one.
So for Bunny, she's now 12 years old. What are your dreams for her when it comes to democracy?
Thank you for this question. So when I think about this, I think about when we used to ask kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? Like Roper has asked this for decades. And for a long time, people would say, I want to be the president. And now that's not even in the top 20. Can anyone guess what the number one thing is that kids want to be?
Firefighter?
Yes, TikTok, that's right. They want to be a content creator. They want to be on YouTube. They want to be online famous because that's what they're dreaming of. That's what they spend their time with. That's what we value. That's what they see. And so for me, I have dreams of our kids wanting to be public leaders. I want them to care about communities because I know that our politics won't feel or function better unless we decide to make it that way. I think about the idea that someone else is coming to save us and know that that's not true. It's up to us to do this. So for me and my daughter, something that's important is I expose her to a lot of things, and I make sure that she knows from people who have viewpoints like mine and people who have viewpoints unlike mine. I like her to see different levels, and I hope that someday she finds a role for herself in there. Whether or not that's public service, I don't much care, but I do want her to understand that when she needs something, she knows where to go. She knows where those levers are, so that she can feel effective and agenic in her own life.
That's awesome. You mentioned in 2022 that only 25% of 18 to 24-year-olds had reported having a political discussion with their parents, which is really mind-boggling. 75% of young adults said, I never had a conversation about politics with their parents. Why is that, do you think?
Well, my best guess is that we feel uncomfortable about doing it. We're under-practiced. We don't know how to do it, and oftentimes we might think schools are going to take care of it. Or maybe we think to ourselves, we should just let them make up their own opinions, or I don't want to interfere and give them my influences. And I don't really think that's the risk. I think the risk is by not talking about it, they don't even know how to engage in the first place. And so that statistic sort of shocked me too, but then working with students, I've been at this university for 10 years, it doesn't surprise me because a lot of them are just like, no, I never talk about that at home.
Yeah, interesting. Well, your book is telling us or reminding us we have to be intentional about this. It's not something we can just, maybe we'll get around to it someday. We have to be intentional. And the beautiful thing is there's reasons to talk about this all the time. I mean, it's not like it's not out there. So I want to mention your book. It opens with the problem. And then you get into chapter 3 and especially chapter 4, and it's the solution. And I think you do such a masterful job of laying out a really clear program or idea for what we could do. And then the second half is a wonderful opportunity to relearn civics ourselves. So it's like a primer on, on politics and on the government and how it works. And so it's going to be great for any person to read it. But I want to mention something you said. I'm going to focus on chapter 4, which is where you give most of your best practical ideas, I think. And in chapter 4, you talk about how to have political conversations. And you mentioned your daughter when she was 10. And this is when the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision overturned Roe v. Wade. And your 10-year-old asked you, what is an abortion? So how did you respond to your 10-year-old with that? And tell us more about that conversation.
Yeah, this happened right in the middle of this book writing process. And it's something where my 10-year-old knew what pregnancy was. She kind of understood the mechanics and basics there. But she did not know what abortion was because it wasn't a topic that we ever had to talk about in our house. And it really wasn't on the news in any meaningful way until the Dobbs decision came down. And when she came to me and she asked that, my first sort of flash was like, oh no, do I have to like make something up right now or try to like sugarcoat this? And then I decided I would just shoot straight with her and tell her, here's what abortion is. And I told her, you know, in the term of a pregnancy, there are some ways to end that pregnancy prior to a baby being born, despite the fact that it existed at some point. And then she sort of asked, well, like, why is this a big deal? Why does this matter for the government? And that got into talking about how now states were going to deal with this because different levels of government get to decide our rules on this. And I contrasted the rules in Mississippi versus in New York City versus in Kansas and kind of said, we're all going to get to have these conversations. We're going to make these decisions. And where we used to have a nationwide agreement or at least policy on this, we're now going to get to do this at the state level and people are going to come to different answers on this. And it wasn't a conversation that actually needed to be feared by me because she's just trying to make sense of her world. She's just trying to figure these things out. She doesn't say like, oh, that's awful, or yes, that's great, choose. She just wanted to learn a little bit more. And I think that's probably true for a lot of hard political conversations. Our kids just want to know a little bit more. And if she had extra questions, I would have gone with her, but I followed her lead, which is pretty much what I think on all of these hard topics, is follow their leads. Let them bring you to wherever they need to get brought, and then go from there. She knows she can always come back to me, but it wasn't that bad of a conversation, despite the fact that I think on face it looked like it could have been scary.
That's good. I thought it was beautiful the way you described it. You talked about the importance of teaching our children critical thinking skills. It's not just imparting our particular view of any one issue. And in fact, I think you made the point that if you think you're going to just give your kids your views, they're likely to turn against those at some point down the road. So you're probably going to turn them into the opposite position as what you're holding. Instead, you talked about teaching your children critical thinking skills. And when our girls were growing up, this was part of what we were trying to teach them. And I remember at one point when my youngest, who's now 34, said to me, Dad, you raised us to be independent thinkers. You raised us to be critical thinkers and to think for ourselves. Of course, she was saying that about something we disagreed about. But I actually think it's a really important idea. So how do you help children think for themselves to become critical thinkers?
So our kids want to do this, right? They're so curious. But the way that I kind of structure it is I think there's 4 sorts of questions that you can kind of ask your kids when they come to you on political topics. And that sort of lays this groundwork for critical thinking. The first one that I like to ask is, what have you heard about that? And the reason I like the question, what have you heard, is it's not asking them to defend a position. They don't have to justify their opinion. They don't have to get defensive. They can just say, I heard this. I heard this on TikTok, or I heard this from Aunt Lindsay, or maybe I saw it on TV. And so in a non-judgmental way, you can say, okay, we've set the table with what we have heard. Then I move to this question, which is, what do you think about that? And then we kind of see, okay, there's a little daylight between these things. I'm having to synthesize stuff. I've heard all these different pieces. Maybe I have these internal values that I can't quite articulate, but they make sense in this way. I think that. The third question I ask is, what do you know about that? And that's the question where when I do this in the classroom setting, it gets like really quiet and everyone's like, oh no, because there's such a gulf between what I think and what I know. And it's in that work, it's in that gap that we start to think about what critical thinking is. And so the fourth question I ask is, what more would we need to know to think about this? And so you might say, oh, well, I'd like to have the statistics on this, or I'd like to figure out how many times does that thing happen? And so I think having conversations where you're not trying to say, defend this, prove it to me that you're right, I don't agree with you. It's let's just figure this out together and kind of see at different intervals what we feel or think on these things, what we know, and what we could know more. And politics is great for this sort of stuff because politics and government, it's current events, but it's also history, it's predictions for the future, it's hopes. It has all these different pieces that allow us to have critical thinking in a lot of different ways. So I think it's like one of the best benefits about talking about politics with your kids is they get to grapple with hard stuff. There's not right answers, there's just a bunch of different answers. And so I think it's one of the best ways to do this work.
That's really awesome. And the idea of asking questions, I mean, I as a preacher, I find that it's easy to start jumping into the answers. This is true even as you're raising your kids, math or whatever else. You want to give them the answer as opposed to inviting them to figure it out for themselves or at least wrestle with it. And I think as a preacher, Jesus asked, I believe it's somewhere around 310 questions in the Gospels. So it's surprising. You think he's the answer man. Instead, anytime somebody asks him a question, he almost always asks a question back. And that's what I appreciated about your methodology there, was it's asking questions and inviting them to think, which leads them to become critical thinkers. I thought that was awesome. Okay, we live in a time where we tend to be, even those of us trying to hold things together and build bridges, tend to have pretty strong opinions about various political candidates, especially, well, let's just say some here on the right, some here on the left. American Public Square tries to bring people together, Democrats, Republicans, and our presidential candidates today. And it's easy for us to make statements about a candidate that would be, you mentioned slurs or, critical comments about the person. And I don't think we think about our kids are listening. So talk a little bit about how can we be careful not to actually teach our children inadvertently the very things we don't like in our society today. That's name calling and negative statements about people.
So I think in some ways we only do this with politicians. Like, we give ourselves a pass to say some of the ugliest, nastiest things about people who, for the most part, are trying their best. I think there is a distinction between federal politicians and state and local politicians that really matters. But our kids usually only hear us in conversation about federal politicians, people who are far away, who are at the top of the game, but the other 50,000 elected officials are state and local officials. I also think it's a strange way to undercut a politician. So I remember when I was writing this piece, someone was talking about a current member of Congress and called her a college dropout and was like, she's a college dropout, what does she know? And I thought, that is not the argument here. The argument that you have is there's some policy choice that this person is making that you disagree with. But the idea that it's okay to just denigrate someone for an achievement that, guess what, the majority of Americans don't have either, doesn't make sense to me. And I don't think that that's good for our kids to hear it. I know that we have challenging politicians. I know that a lot of us feel like there's challenging politicians that are taking up a lot of the oxygen in politics right now. And so it's not that I'm saying don't criticize politicians. Politicians deserve criticism. We're meant to hold them accountable. But I do think choosing the words in a more intentional way is a better model for our kids to have, because we don't want us to just have a politics that is like, who can name call better, because then we're going to get politicians who can play that game, and that's how they win. And so I think it's better if we have a framework that says, okay, that's a challenging perspective you have. Here's why I disagree with it, versus you're a dummy, a moron, an idiot, which is what we hear on average.
Yeah, I think that's really good. Your critique of that. I was thinking about a conversation I had with somebody several years ago. I hear this a lot, like all politicians are crooks, or they're all liars, or whatever. I'm like, well, I personally know 20 politicians who are in office or have held office, and none of them were crooks, and none of them were liars. They were all people trying to do the right thing for the right reason, whether I agreed with them or not. And so being able to correct that and to not contribute to that, I think, is important. And I think when it comes to Scripture, again, I'm a preacher, so I'm going to quote this for a minute, but there was a passage of Scripture we had our congregation memorize several years ago, and it's where Paul says, don't let anything cruel or anything unclean come out of your mouth, but only what's useful for building others up as there is need, that your words might give grace to those who hear. Or I think of Jesus who said, take the log out of your own eye before you take the splinter out of someone else's. And so, those kind of ideas you mentioned, that's just good humanity, right? And yet we forget that. We think we don't have to do that when it comes to politics. And our kids are listening and they're learning from us how we talk about politicians and politics. Let's talk about, so you walk through introducing your kids to politics and politicians. And you mentioned just briefly earlier, but, how do we introduce our children to, real politicians, real politics? What does that look like?
So I think part of it is that we sort of should demand this. Our politicians need to see kids. Most politics and government happens in spaces where kids are not welcomed, and so it's not surprising that children's needs are not prioritized or the needs of young families are not prioritized, because that's just not the spaces that they operate in. I'm someone who has always brought my daughter, if we have like a state of the district event that my city council person puts on, I'll bring my daughter. And sure, She'll find it boring at some point, but that means that these people see that this is someone who matters in this way too. And then she gets to see a lot of different politicians and kind of like make sense internally about what she likes and what she doesn't like. I think it's also better if we could push for childcare in some of these spaces. I was really lucky when I moved to New York City to have a district where the man who was running it set aside a budget and said, for every sort of meeting we have, we're gonna have childcare so that young parents can come here and do politics because they get taken out of these spaces. But when it comes to like local politicians, emails work pretty well. Like they want to, especially if you live in that district, they want to meet you. They want to know the families because they know that their success turns on just a few votes sometimes. And so it usually just takes initiative on your part. And I will say, it's not always easy. Like we emailed the mayor, he got back in a week, and then on the day of, his aide was like, I'm a little busy today. And I was like, no. We planned this a few months ago. I think we'll meet you today. And then they were able to find 5 minutes later. Yeah. And so it does take persistence, but they will relent. And you just, and I know that because that's how it works where I am too. You just have to kind of bother them a little more.
Absolutely. It is amazing, but I mean, most of them will want to do that, and especially if you've got a kid with you.
Yeah.
That's
or multiple kids.
Multiple
like a
kids is
school
even
trip.
better.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I'd love for you to walk us through. You talked about, and you mentioned it. You had just a brief bit about it earlier, but talking to your children at different ages. So the kinds of things that you can do. I thought you had a really great plan for when kids are 5 to 9, 10 to 14, 15 to 18. Can you walk us through a little bit more of what we do at those various ages with our children?
Yeah. At 5 to 9, they want to know the people. Like they want to just understand what this is. They can't really hold on to concepts because it's not what they like. It's not what their capacities allow them for. So I think that's like, telling them about some of the presidents, having books that tell them who their politicians are, people who have been in history, and then being willing to talk to them about that. At that age, it really is letting them see how politics happens, not necessarily making sure they're getting it all, because they're going to absorb some of it. At 10 to 14, I really do think you need to turn things up a little bit where you can have conversations with them. And they're likely to be trying out their budding independence anyhow. They'll probably tell you about how they know all these things and like, how could you ever think that? Let them do that. Have those discussions with them. Let them try these things out. I also think I said this earlier, but I really like the idea of your 13 or 14-year-old being your family researcher. When you have politicians that you don't know about, maybe running for the House, maybe running for state politics or running in your local politics, say, hey, can you go figure out some stuff about these people so we can know who we're going to vote for or talk about this? They can do that work, and that lets them see, what does it take to do this? How do I determine who I like or who I don't like? I also think at both of those ages, you should take your kids to vote with you. I am always shocked at how few children I see voting because I know that voting is habit forming and it's a tradition, but you can't get there unless someone shows you the way. I also know that there's some cities that are doing things like having contests about who can read the I voted sticker. And in Ulster County, a county in New York City, a 13-year-old and a 14-year-old have won it in the last 4 years. And the stickers are crazy. 2 years ago was a spider that was a rainbow that said, I voted. This year, it's going to be this pretty little teddy bear kitty looking thing that says, I voted. But that lets the kids think about this, and they go get their sticker, and that's fun. When they're 15 to 18, I think there's 5 things that you have to do. And I'll just give you the short version right now. One is you have to teach them how to register to vote. And you might think that's going to happen in schools, but it doesn't. Only about a quarter of our 18-year-olds are registered to vote, despite the fact that over 50% of our kids live in states where you can pre-register at 16 or 17. It's just not happening in schools. And registering to vote unlocks every other right that you have. And so that's like number one. You got to teach them and show them how to do it. Kids don't often know how to do these things because it requires things like their social security number. 18-year-olds they don't have a sense of that. You have to help them with that. Sometimes they have to mail something somewhere. They don't really know how to address envelopes. They don't know where you put the stamp. It sounds like a joke, but it's not. I work with college students who are like, I don't know how to do this. Okay. So we have to help them, at least in the first instance, get registered to vote. We need to talk to them about the difference between primary and general elections. And I say that knowing that Kansas is a closed primary state, which is the same in New York. However, in Kansas, one party tends to dominate, which is the Republican Party. So most of those competitive elections happen in the primary. In New York, it's flipped, where most of our competitive elections happen in the primary for Democrats. Our kids need to know the differences between primary and general elections. When we talk to teachers, they said that's one thing that they don't know. Because if they learn anything, it's the presidential primary, which is the only one that's like that. Everything else is so different. The third thing is our kids need to have a better concept of federalism. And you can have that conversation at 15, which is the local government does different things than the state government, than the federal government. So if they're mad about the time that their school starts, they can't call the president and get an executive order to fix it. It's not that. It's like, call a school board. It's get something very local or get to state politics. And when we think about the things that a lot of young people care about, things like gun licensings or things like legalized marijuana or things like access to reproductive health care, that's all happening at the state level. So they need to know that their politics matter at different levels. The fourth one is I think our kids should read the Constitution at least once before they're 18. And I know that's a hard sell because everyone's like, they do it in school. They don't. It's only 19 pages if you print it out. And I'm not saying you sit and do it in one day, but I am saying that it makes sense to me. If you're going to play democracy for the rest of your life in the United States, you should have a pass at the rule book. And I don't think it's that bad for you to do it as a family. Chapter 7 outlines the ways you can do it on car rides, at the dinner table, over years. Here's some questions you can ask, because I think it's important that they know these things. And then the last one is how to have hard conversations. Because by the time I get college students, they're oftentimes too afraid to offend someone else or feel uncomfortable themselves, so they just don't do it. And that doesn't work. We know that our politics doesn't feel that good. We know that it doesn't function that well. And it's not going to feel or function better unless we start to have hard conversations about how to change these things.
Those are such great responses. I mean, those are really great ideas. And about half of them, I'm like, man, I wished I would have thought of that when my kids were growing up. That was, the other half I think we did, but the half, I mean, it was just awesome. And I love the idea for the middle school kids of having them research the candidates. I mean, that's brilliant. Speaking of candidates, you mentioned in here that I think it was maybe a study that was done, or maybe you just are asking the question, how few people knew who the Speaker of the House was, the Senate Majority Leader was, and their own governor was, as well as local representatives. I just would love, it'd be fun to have a little pop quiz right now and have you write down really quickly who is the Senate Majority Leader, who is the House, who is the Speaker of the House, and who is your governor. Do you know the answers to those questions?
Yeah, can any table get it all right?
You don't have to do this. I'm just saying. I thought I had to stop for a second. Like, I got them all right, but it was interesting to think about that for a second. All right. So I loved on page 100, under style and approach, you talked about these productive conversations. You mentioned 4 things, and I thought these were great, even if it's not with your children. These are great things to do when it comes to, or ways of posturing when it comes to conversations with anybody about politics. Can you walk through those 4 things?
Yes. So the reason that I wrote these is because I know that at least in the house that I was raised in, it was kind of like, we'll talk about that later. We'll talk about when you're older. And I don't think that's the way we should do this. We should engage our kids when they want to talk about these things now. And the first thing that I say is you should have curiosity for their ideas. This is not a one-way street of like, I know politics, let me tell you what it is. We should be curious about what they're hearing, what they're thinking, how they're processing these things. So I think that's step 1, is instead of saying, I'm the older one who knows more, let's be curious about the way that they're conceiving of this, because they're the ones who stand to inherit this system. We might as well figure out what they're thinking. The second is we all need to check our own biases. And I know we've heard biases for 20 years now, and everyone's like, oh, I got it. But what I mean by this is we live different lives than our children. Our lived experiences are different. We might be a different gender, we might be a different race, we're certainly a different age. And so the way that we see things is not going to be the way that they see things, and that's just how it is. So we have to make sure that we appreciate the differences that we come to those conversations with. The third thing is, I want us to respect what our teens say. And this is sort of a change from, we are the adults, they should respect us. I want us to show them that we respect their opinions, because that allows them to grow with that. That allows them to say, ooh, okay, there's a little room here. Maybe I'll go develop that more. And then at the end, I always like to extend gratitude. Whoever's going to do these conversations with you, show them that you care. That means turning off your cell phone. That means saying, yes, I'll do this with you. If you can't do it right now, yeah, why don't we do that this weekend? Let's set aside 10 minutes and figure this out. And then thanking them at the end, saying, I'm glad that you were willing to do this with me, so that they're going to come back and have these conversations with you again. That's sort of the best framework that I've thought of. It works in my classroom, and I think it works in a lot of interpersonal conversations.
That's awesome. I'm going to take just a couple more questions, and we're going to go to questions from the floor. So I wanted to ask, if you were trying to explain to your daughter the difference between Republicans and Democrats, what would you say?
This is a hard question. right?
Oh, by the way, I'll let you know, as a congregation, not that all these folks are from Resurrection, but as a congregation, we're 40% Republican, 40% Democrat, and 20% Independent. So there you go.
Yeah, so if my daughter said, what are the Democrats and what are the Republicans? I'll tell you what I do with my students because they're far more likely to ask this. I ask them to go to the party platforms and look for a word that they care about. So the Republican Party platform is new this year. It's been updated. The last time it was updated in 2016. It's about 24 pages long. The Democratic Party platform is 94 pages long. And I'd say, come up with whatever term you care about, hit Control F to go find in their document, does it say anything about the thing that you care about? That's like a great step. Go to the source, figure out what it is. Oftentimes my students will come back and say, they didn't have something on like AI tech or something. That's what I really care about. Okay, that's a little bit harder. Then I'll say, go to something like DC Inbox is a tool that I shunt a lot of them to and say, who's talking about this? What are they saying on this? Because I think the best way to sort of know a party is to go learn a party yourself versus hearing like, well, I think it's this, or here's the person who speaks on behalf of that. And so I push people to just go see what the party says themselves. When my daughter comes to me, she understands a little bit more about partisanship than I think most 12-year-olds do because she's so steeped in it. But for me, I know that party politics is not just national party priorities. In some parts of the country, one party is more effective than the other. Like in New York City, the Democratic Party is sort of the only party in town that can do things. In other parts of the country, the Republican Party is only the party in town who can do things. And so there's both this like programmatic piece, what party is working in your area, but also this ideological piece, which is go see what they say they're going to do on that. That's probably the best guidance I would have.
That's excellent. All right, yesterday the Chiefs beat the Bengals 26-25. And you had something in here, I love this quote. Think about how sports would be different if all we focused on was how much we hated specific players or coaches from the other team, rather than the celebratory fandom that characterizes most major league sports. And I do happen to have a couple of pictures here. This is at the end of the game, as Joe Burrows, he was pretty deflated, but he's walking over with his arms outstretched, and Patrick Mahomes is walking over with his arms outstretched. And the next picture is, shows you when they're holding on to each other for a moment, and talking to each other and saying, hey, good job, or, better luck next time, or whatever. But how different this looks. And these guys are like, they're out there sacrificing their bodies to win this game, and it really matters to them to what politics looks like. You want to say any more about that?
Well, I mean, I do think we are capable of learning hard things. We are capable of following trajectories of teams. We could do the same for politics, but it would feel better if we didn't hate it and they didn't hate each other. And I think when we talk about politics, it's important to think about how we're all just trying to make a better world. That's what most politicians are doing. I do think at the national level, we have the congressional baseball teams where we have a Republican team and a Democratic team, and they play ball all season. There's a softball team for the women as well. I think we should have them mixed together. I actually think they should have to play on the same teams where it's half Democrats, half Republicans against half Democrats, half Republicans. Because that way, you do have to work together. You do have to throw to one another and make sure you want to catch instead of beating the other team and knowing that you're going to beat them in politics too. So I just know that we have abilities to cheer for teams in positive ways that aren't just built on hating the other side. And politics would be better if we could see it that way.
Yeah, I think that's great. So I was thinking about your suggestions on involving kids and working for change, and this is where I want to wrap up my portion and then go to the questions. As my kids were growing up, we were trying to do this, and I don't know that we thought about it as clearly as what you've talked about in the book, but I remember it was 2020, I think it was 2003, it was February of 2003, and our nation was heading towards war with Iraq. We were already in Afghanistan after 9/11, and the claim was that there were weapons of mass destruction. And we hadn't found them yet. And there was a group of folks who were gathering at 119th and Row with signs. They were very positive. They were just saying, let's keep working towards peace. Let's not rush into war. And I thought, this is a great opportunity for my children to see what it's like to go actually hold up a sign and stand for something that mattered. I remember it was snowing, and a month later we were in the war. Never did find weapons of mass destruction, but it was, I felt like it was a chance to teach my kids. I took each of my daughters to Washington, D.C. on separate daddy-daughter trips so that we could go and we, saw all the sights, and we went to meet our congressperson, and we, walked into their chambers, and we went to the White House and toured the White House, and, a number of other things. And And I just found that was really rich, you know, and we talked about why were there people protesting in front of the White House and what was that about? And you know, I think I have a picture of my youngest daughter. We were in the White House at Christmas one year, and just to help them think about these big pictures, you know, these big ideas. And anything else you want to say to encourage us about involving our children like this, you know, helping them get involved already before they're old enough to vote, to get involved in what's happening in our society?
I think this is something where you follow your kid's lead. If your kid says, you know what, I want to play on this playground, but every time I go there, the basketball hoops are all like broken, and I don't really like that as much. I think the support is, well, why don't you go figure out how we could fix that? Maybe you can go say, is this like a Parks Department question? Is this a City Council question? You probably don't have a protest for broken basketball hoops. But I do think letting kids see what their pathways can be. If they have something, I like this a lot in schools. My daughter was unhappy that they had non-recyclable utensils in her school. And I said, well, why don't you have a little list, try to get people to sign up and see if they agree with you, and then you can present that to the teachers. And so it's just giving her a pathway, and within like 3 weeks, they had nearly all of their grades signed up and a bunch of teachers signed on. Now, they didn't get non-recyclable utensils, but even in failure, they learned a process. They learned what it is to advocate. They learned what it is to get people on board. And so I think there's plenty of ways for our kids to get involved before they can vote. They can do art for change. They can do things like what you've been able to do. And I think showing them the public spaces of where this work happens is also really valuable, because then they can kind of respect it a little bit more and understand that it's not just people saying mean things online or TV. It's like, no, this is a place where we do work.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, we've got some questions. Claire, you want to tackle the questions or ask the questions?
Yes, you betcha. We've been getting some great questions. Thank you so much. Great.
Claire, I'm going to pause you for just a second. So guys, we have no monitors up here and we can't really understand or very well. There's a big echo up here. I don't know if you can fix it, but Claire, if you wouldn't mind maybe coming up here so that we can hear you better if you're standing near us, and maybe speak directly towards us, and then we can hear a little bit better when you ask the question.
You bet, you bet. And I will speak into the microphone so everyone else can hear. Thank you. The conversation has been excellent so far. I'm on the edge of my seat over here. First question that I want to just answer directly was about this program being recorded, which the answer to that is yes, this program is being recorded and it will be posted to Church of the Resurrection's website after this event, a little later on in the week, as well as on APS's website. So just FYI, if you want to share this with anyone else in your network, please do. First question for Lindsey. We've heard a little bit about how you're working with your daughter to raise a good citizen. An audience member here in the live audience tonight asks, did your parents raise you to be a good citizen? I mean, I think the answer is yes, but could you elaborate on some of the things that were going on in your household growing up?
Yes, I can. My parents are right here because and I would have been in the 75% bucket of people who never talked with their parents about politics. This is not to say that they didn't raise me in a way that I think is good, but it is certainly not in a way that raised me to understand politics. Instead, what happened for me was when I went to the University of Kansas, I asked myself, what can these people teach me here that I couldn't learn that well before? And so I majored in political science and I minored in African and African American studies because I said, these are things I don't know a lot about, but there's people on this faculty that can teach me. My parents raised me to be curious, they raised me to seek information, and so in doing so, they put me on this trajectory. But no, we didn't talk about politics in my house. No, I never went and voted with them. And actually, my dad called me after he read the book and he was like, oh my God, I've learned so much. And I was like, yeah. And he's still like my biggest cheerleader, but it wasn't a household that prioritized politics.
Excellent, okay. Got some great questions coming in, so thank you for submitting all of these. So, Lindsey, you have outlined a timeline for raising a kid who understands how democracy and a republic works. How do you propose for a population of children who do not have caring adults who are able to either spend time or their experience with them? What model works for them?
This is a really hard question. And research on sort of what works for kids finds that households are where a lot of the things happen, but there are also ripple effects within communities. And so where you have communities where there's like a lot of immigrant parents who maybe didn't grow up in this country, it's very hard for them to teach their kids about how you do this work because they just don't have the background in it. And so if you do have the privilege of growing up where you're living now and understanding the system that you're participating in, doing that work with your own kids is a way to ripple and let them have conversations with their friends. It's also something that's really hard in schools. When we look at the schools that have the time in their curricular sort of periods to give to civics, those are ones that aren't dealing with like language learning. They aren't dealing with students who are having to be folded into new communities and understand new cultures. And so it's a very valid question that this is hard work to do, but the best thing that we can do is do it with our kids and know that that sort of sets the bar a little bit differently for them to do that work among their peers.
Fantastic. What do you think about the value of celebrity endorsements?
Well, I'll tell you, I have a Swiftie at my house who was very excited, I guess, that her celebrity that she most looks up to said something. But here's what I'll say about that endorsement. I think the way that Taylor Swift wrote that out was very artful. If you get into the second and third paragraphs, she sort of goes through her reasoning and she says, these are the issues that I care about. They are my priorities. They might not be yours. But because they're my priorities, I've made this decision. I encourage you to look inward and find what you prioritize, and then go pick politicians that match those things for you. And so the value of a celebrity endorsement is something that political scientists grapple with, because it's hard to say, you know, like, did this person vote this way just because this other person said they should? But they are gonna happen. We are gonna have people that we look up to, or we evaluate and appreciate their musicianship, or maybe their athleticism. We don't have to listen to all of them, but I think the argument of, it's important that I care and I made a choice is a good one for us to have, and one that I think that we can take on our own, even if we disagree with the choices that she's made or any other celebrity who's making an endorsement.
Getting a round of applause for that one. That's great. Okay, let's go to, how do we encourage our kids, this is from Haley online, how do we encourage our kids to know the importance of talking politics when oftentimes they're fearful about speaking up because of the violence or hateful comments directed at folks who are speaking up about their beliefs? How do we help them be more courageous about that when it's kind of scary?
It is scary, and I think a lot of times it's scary in our online spaces. I think that's why we have to do this work in our homes, with the people we love, with the people we trust, with the people who will allow to make mistakes, apologize, and come back from it. And that is a practice. That is like any other skill. You just have to be willing to repeatedly do it and know that they're not gonna get it right, we're not gonna get it right, we don't have all the answers, but we're willing to try with them. And I think in showing that in sort of family spaces, you give them more tools to do this when they're creating their own families or when they're in communities at work or at school. And so I think the best advice that I'd have there is do the practice with them and be willing to make mistakes along the way and own up to it, because that's gonna happen.
Goodness. I just have to say, you know, pragmatic advice. That's exactly what you're giving us. I think that's what the people obviously want. And just thank you for giving us tools for the toolbox, because it's tough right now. I've got a couple more questions, if that is okay. And we're receiving a lot of great input from audience members. This is a great one I'd love to hear you expand upon. Okay, I'm sorry, I cannot read the name, but this is from someone in the audience. People tend to be more liberal when they are young, and they become more conservative when they're older. Why is this normalized? Should we try to change it? Do you have any thoughts on that?
So I think sort of two big things on this. One is actually the political science on this doesn't bear that out as much as we kind of think it to be true, in the sense that most people form their party attachments early in life, and they usually keep those party attachments as they grow. Right now, we have it such that older people tend to have conservative viewpoints relative to younger people, but that hasn't always been the case, and we sort of like move in that way. But the second big thing that I'll say I think and know on this is that it makes sense for as you age to want things to be more aligned with how you're used to them. Sort of like the impulse to have conservatism is like this impulse to kind of corral uncertainty in a way. And that makes sense as you grow to sort of like tamp that down. Whereas when you're younger, there's like a more possibility-laden future. And so there's just like more varieties. I don't think that's necessarily something we have to work against. And I think the way that I think of politics is not like, it's an end-all 1 or 0 battle for conservatism or liberalism. It's a pendulum. And it's not a pendulum that's a clock. It swings sometimes really far this way and only a little bit here. And then sometimes it goes back and forth. And that's okay. And I don't think that's something we can change. I don't even necessarily think it's something that we should change. I think it's something to accept and write out and say like, okay, maybe right now something looks a little bit too left for you. Well, if you care about that, why don't you work to bring it back to where you want, or vice versa. So I don't necessarily see that as a problem. I see that as sort of just like what we're going to have because this is the system that we're in.
Claire, can I comment on this too? So people ask me, and our congregation has heard me say this many times, people ask me, I can't figure you out. Are you liberal or conservative? And my answer is always yes, of course. And they're like, no, which are you? Are you liberal or conservative? I'm like, we have to be a bit of both of those things. To be conservative means you're conserving. You're holding on to, you're trying to hold on to things that matter, and the things that you think shouldn't be just cast aside because they're no longer in style or vogue. But to be liberal means to be generous, open to reform, willing to see things in new ways. And if you're conservative without being liberal, you're stuck. If you're liberal without being conservative, you're unmoored. But somehow holding those two things together is actually important. And the reality is we're all liberal compared to somebody. And we're all conservative compared to somebody else. If you all have an uncle or an aunt or somebody who is far more conservative or far more liberal than you are, no matter where you stand. But this idea of saying, no, these are both good values and they are important, and we need to be a bit of both of those things, I think is key.
I'm glad that that's what your answer is. I think I'm going to steal it because my students, they always like want to figure it out. And in my second year of teaching, one of my best teaching evaluations was from a student who ended up writing his name in his email so he could try to get the answer. He was like, Professor Cormack, I think you're a Republican because you said this, but I think you're a Democrat because you said this. And we've been trying to figure it out all semester, so what's the answer? And I was like, ooh, this is actually the most supreme compliment I could get in this class. I'm so happy that you guys are confused. But I think your answer is better. The answer of like, yes, like, yes, I am these.
Yeah.
I'm going to second that. That answer is great. I'm going to bottle that up, and we will be using that because it's very succinct. So, Reverend Hamilton, thank you for that. Okay, I've got one last question, and afterward, Lindsey will be signing and selling books in the back, so I want to make sure to have plenty of time for that, as well as any closing questions that Reverend Hamilton has. So again, back to pragmatic ways to help people kind of do this. This question comes from Kristen in our audience. What are examples of how to start a conversation with young people, right? If it's not already on the news or, we bring our own biases at the dinner table without engaging them. And we have grandkids age 6, it looks like, to 14. So for those of us who kind of need a little help just getting over the hump and how to start that conversation, what would you recommend?
That's a great question, and I think it shows someone who's like interested in caring about doing this work. Something that I find in the conversations that I have in my classrooms with my students is I ask them if they want to do a discussion or a debate, and I let us like figure out what we're doing here. And I think if you can say like, hey, I really want to talk about this thing, will you do that with me? And you put it to them, and maybe they say like, no, I don't want to talk about that. Okay, you tried. But if they say yes, by saying, yeah, I just kind of want to help figure it out a little bit, maybe here where you're at and here where I'm at. We're not trying to convince each other. And then some of you are going to have kids who want to debate, who want to spar. I was one of those people. And then that's a different thing. But I think asking them what they're okay with doing and inviting them to that conversation in a way that feels comfortable with them is a good way to start it. And if they've never thought about a subject, maybe say like, ooh, it really matters to me. Could we maybe make some time to do this? And then set a date at your next dinner to have that sort of conversation, hoping that they've come back and done a little research on their own.
That's awesome. Okay, I have one last question and then one comment. But before I do that, I want to mention if any of you are not involved in a faith community at all, we would love to welcome you here at Resurrection. During the month of October, our whole focus is going to be on the golden rule and Jesus and politics and what his platform might be and how we can practice politics without losing our religion. How can we be people who bring people together as opposed to tearing them apart? We're going to try our best to do that, and we have special speakers every week during that month, really amazing people. And one weekend is just a serve weekend to go out and serve in the community, and we're trying to bring people together. And so if you don't have a church family, I just wanted to give you that invitation. So I was thinking about Thanksgiving. So now, not talking about children, but talking about us. So, and I was reminded, as you were talking of Saturday Night Live, when they had, I don't know if you ever watch Saturday Night Live, I don't watch it very often, but sometimes, and they had, it was Thanksgiving, and they had the Thanksgiving meal, and the crazy parents or family members who were saying nutty things, and how do you respond? Not, your family's not like this, but how would you respond? How would you suggest we respond when we're at we're in conversations with family members or others, and they say things that just make us inside just, crazy. So you're the expert, help us understand, how do we respond when our family members say things that are unsettling to us?
So it's hard, right? There are some people who are gonna say things that you can't reason with them, and you kind of just have to see that, know that, understand that. But something that I ask my students to do on Thanksgiving, I actually always give them 2 Thanksgiving assignments. One is I give them a question that I say they should ask in a family setting and report back on how it goes. They can pick the question, but it has to be a political one. So I think you should have these conversations. But the second is I ask them to ask their parents about if they had X many dollars, how would they distribute it among candidates so they can figure things out? And so they kind of oh, okay, I know them a little bit better that way. But I think when it comes to fractious political conversations, it's on us to take the temperature down. So if you've assessed that this uncle of yours is just gonna go and rant, there's not much you can do there. And I wouldn't say oh, make sure you're pulling him in. I understand that there's sometimes you have to accept it. But if you think there's a little window of hope or a little window of opportunity, I think it's good to come back to, what have you heard about that? I think it's such a good place to start, because then it stops them from saying, here is all the thoughts. It says, ooh, what are my inputs? Why am I saying these things? How did I get to this place in the first place? So I really like bringing it back to that first question, which is, what have you heard, or what are you hearing about this? And then letting the temperature come down from there.
I think that's great. And even just responding with questions, is good. I had this conversation the other day with somebody, and they were very adamant about something. Can you tell me more about, some examples of that? And they had no examples of the thing that they, were passionate about. And I didn't have to say anything. We just had a good conversation. And then the kind of, I love you, you matter to me.
Yeah, the gratitude at the end.
Yeah. So that leads me to this last comment. One of our teenagers here, we were just in Poland on a trip, a group of our youth, a meeting with Ukrainian and Polish people. And it was a great trip. And going to Auschwitz and doing some other things that were really powerful. But as we were sitting talking, she was talking about politics, and she said, we're from Kansas City. You're from Kansas City, don't forget this. And she said, Kansas City, I think that means we should lead in politics with kindness and curiosity. Kindness and curiosity. And I just thought that was and this is what you're teaching, I think, in this book. And so I want to say, on behalf of really everybody who's going to read it or hear about it, and all of us who are here tonight, thank you so much for writing the book. Thank you for your thoughtfulness. We're really proud of you as somebody who's a Blue Valley Northwest High School graduate, and grateful for the book that you've given and the tool that you've given to us. Would you all join me in expressing your appreciation? Lindsey Cormack. Thank you.
Thank you. This was so nice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I want you to know we have tons of cookies. We're going to take those. The books are available for purchase right back over here, and Lindsey's going to be signing books over there. So if you want to stop by, say hi to her, have her sign your book for you, or for your kids, if you're a grandparent, pick one up tonight from her. And Lindsey, again, thank you so much for being here tonight. God bless you.